Welcome to another session of Talking Trade. I'm Ken Wasylik, Managing Director of EM Wasylik and Associates, an international business development company.
And I'm Sandi Siegel, President of ME Day. We welcome back our guest today, Sarah Helton, Partner and Practice Group Chair, Government Procurement and Trade at Michael Best Strategy. So happy to have you back, Sarah. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Sandi. Thank you, Ken. I always enjoy our discussion.
Well, it's been some time, a few months since the trade situation has developed in 2025 here. But not only are we seeing on the trade tariff side, but we're also seeing the administration use other tools, trade tools like export controls, investment restrictions, supply chain, trying to attract more domestic production, direct foreign investment in kind of forcing our partners to invest in the United States. So can you just kind of, give us an overall of what the administration's focus is and how is this affecting the U.S. economy?
Ken, the administration, yes, it's interesting to see how the tariffs are being used, but also in combination with other tools, as you mentioned, whether it's with the export controls or also restrictions. But one thing to just highlight from what you had mentioned there is what are the requirements around investment in the United States? And so we're understanding that there's a lot of tools that are being integrated and requirements being integrated in as a part of the trade discussions that our leadership is having with other countries. And as we take an example, if you were to look at the EU and US agreement that's been outlined, what is included in there is requirements for purchases of energy, right? Requirements for purchases of AI chips. In addition to that, of the requirements for investment of $550 billion in certain sectors by 2029. But then you also, from that side, add in certain requirements around, for instance, inbound and exbound investment controls, right? What are both parties going to do around duty evasion? And so you see that really tailoring into other third parties, like, for instance, China. So we look at then Japan, that also has certain investment requirements into the United States in critical sectors that are a key focus for President Trump, and that we have seen that integrated into the 232 investigations, like pharmaceuticals and semiconductors and energy. So what's interesting about this is we've understood from the very beginning that President Trump has keen interest on anyone that wants to come to the United States and invest, come, including U.S. and foreign manufacturers. And he has been using tariffs as the initial tool to kickstart that discussion and then impose, further requirements. I think what's going to be noteworthy is then watching the actual how this comes into play in reality. Are we going to see those investments? What industries are those going to be coming from? And in what other countries are we going to be seeing similar requirements integrated into those trade deals in the same way?
Well, it's kind of interesting because the Wall Street Journal had an extensive article on the the energy requirements that the EU promised, like doubling their imports of natural gas and oil from the United States. And the bottom line is we just don't have the facilities to actually make this happen. We don't have the terminals, we don't have the pipelines, we don't have the ships to actually make it happen. So going to your point, we have this agreement that they're going to increase their energy purchases. But when you get into the execution phase of it, the question really is who's making the investment in the infrastructure of the ports and the authorities in Texas or wherever, Louisiana, to actually implement this particular agreement.
Exactly. Right.
And I would add to one area to watch then is what happens, how that's complemented by the domestic policy side of it. Because a big part of President Trump's agenda, separate from international policy, has been, for instance, regulatory reform, expediting of permitting. And so how can, for some of those challenges that you mentioned, how is that going to go hand in hand to really result in the success that, President Trump is envisioning in this.
And I think you touched on some key points here in setting these requirements, but can we deliver? And once again, by integrating all these other, the infrastructure and all these other pieces, can it all come together with the vision of and the objectives that trade policy is hoping to meet? And I think, in fact, that's part of the real challenge here. Let's talk about 232 a little bit. I can tell you in my world, that is probably the most challenging and disruptive. In particular, the investigations and all the additional duties being implemented for metals, the steel, aluminum, copper, and so forth. And I want to talk about that a little bit and explain a little bit for perhaps some of our listeners that don't understand. Steel and aluminum have had duties, additional duties and quotas for some time, obviously protected commodity here in the US, and, raw material, bars, rods, coils, things like that. The huge expansion that we've seen in this administration has been on what's called derivatives, right? So any article that has some of these materials in them. And it's so incredibly burdensome on importers if you have any type of commodity that has this material. You're now forced to try to break down the value and report the value of the steel leg on the office desk that you're selling. We now have to report recently to the list of derivatives is any food product that has an outer metal container of aluminum, and be able to break down the value and the content and the weight and information that is not always available or known to importers. And the lack of those details means you're paying that 50% duty on everything. Talk a little bit about the mindset. And I understand there's invitation to continue to solicit items that get added to the derivatives list, right? And there's just, there's so many unanswered questions on how you assess the value of that steel or aluminum content in a finished good. What's going on in Washington, or, I have to imagine people are complaining, and it's having a significant impact on a lot of non-metal, industries, everything from furniture to food and everything else. I just wonder, is that the real intent, and what's been the reaction in that way?
Yes, Sandi, it has been a new process, to your point around derivatives. And also a process that everyone is learning in large part as Department of Commerce has implemented it and really released their findings from the first wave of petitions that was submitted a few months ago. You highlighted, right, how many new products are included. It's not just focused now around some of the raw steel and aluminum. We have a lot of components, and we have a lot of finished goods that are now defined as derivatives. And without the clear understanding of what are the thresholds around or requirements around how we actually define a derivative. So nearly every HTS code that was petitioned to be defined as a derivative, BIS, out of Department of Commerce, accepted that petition and declared it as a derivative. In fact, that is now facing those 50% tariffs, at least on the steel and aluminum value. Now, a few noteworthy things is we're now in the second phase, or a second round of petitions. There will be a third round coming up in January then as well. This is a process we will also see, as you mentioned, for copper. And there is also a derivatives process that will be for the lumber and timber that was just released too. So this could be a very expansive process. And what's interesting is who's eligible to actually submit petitions. it is, right? The producers of the product itself, but you also have producers of derivatives. So when you're opening it up to any producers of derivatives, then you're essentially, it could open up to all manufacturers here in the United States in more or less ways of those derivatives, and really be impactful in the sense of 232s can very likely be more permanent in nature than what we may see with AIBA, depending on the Supreme Court case. So for importers, what we've seen is some have appreciation for how expansive this process has been and understand they need to be watching and be very diligent about engaging through the process. And also too, it's going to be interesting to see how much producers in the United States watch it closely and understand whether they want to be on the offense and use it as a way to potentially have a competitive advantage for anyone that continues to import such derivative products. But it is expansive. It could be a very slippery slope. And this is not going, what we've seen in steel and aluminum, I believe, is just the beginning for a lot of these other 232 investigations.
And can you just touch for, explaining, are there qualifying, conditions for someone to make a petition on these articles? Do you have to be, a producer of a certain volume or in the industry, or, what are the restrictions of being able to, petition for getting something on the list?
Sandy, we can base it off of what we know so far for steel and aluminum in the first round.
Okay.
And then if the process will be changed in the future, we don't know yet.
Right.
But so far, we understand those that are eligible to submit petitions are those producers of the steel and aluminum or of the derivatives and the trade associations of those. As we reviewed some of the petitions throughout that process, we did see a lot of steel aluminum producers submit, hundreds of HTS codes. And really with the argument that if for instance, the finished product isn't being manufactured in the United States, that means that finished product is not utilizing the steel or aluminum coming from the United States. And that is what harms the domestic industry and therefore is a threat to national security. Now, further requirements as far as what minimum steel and aluminum, we haven't seen that included in the actual requirements from BIS, at least from what we've reviewed. But we do understand that Department of Commerce has to consider two things in then agreeing to impose the tariffs. Is one, is the product in fact a derivative? And if it is, then is it a threat to national security? And that's, in the end, that's where they ended up with, 407 additional HTS codes that would be defined as derivatives.
Taking this maybe a little bit further, going into the future here, the USTR and Department of Commerce have announced several requests for information and on some new investigations, like you said, on other derivatives, machine products, related maybe to the USMCA, maybe in other agreements. Yeah, what is the overall administrative interest in requesting this information, and how do you see the information being used going forward?
And I know we've all been busy on the trade side, but just over the past several weeks, there have been so many requests for comments and launch of new investigations that really, keeps everyone alert to understand how do we engage, right? Not only with our members of Congress, directly with the administration, but also too, through official processes where they're collecting information. And so over the past couple of weeks, we saw that firsthand. First off, the Section 301 tariffs, we've talked about it exhaustively right on other podcasts. Well, we have another review coming up of USTR, and there are 178 exclusions that remain that really have been out of the light right now, but we understand that they're going through a line-by-line review. So for those importers that benefit from those, if you don't weigh in, count on losing it. And so again, why that request for information is so important. When we look at USMCA, this is one where, again, USTR has released a request for information, and understanding this really kicks off the official processes for that. But one to really, I think, has garnered the attention more this year than probably over the last round of negotiations, because of what we've seen where we are to date with our trading partners with Mexico and Canada and the IEEPA tariffs and other requirements. With that being said, USTR is going to be particularly interested in what's working, what's not working with USMCA. And interesting enough, Ambassador Greer just this past week had commented on how USTR is going to approach negotiations around USMCA in more of a bilateral way of understanding this. This agreement hasn't been perfect. So again, through USTR's release and request for information to stakeholders, really important of what's working in the agreement, what's not, and how they encourage and ask USTR to consider those as a part of their negotiations. And of course, Congress has a special role in USMCA as well. Mm-hmm. But Ken and Sandi, then we turn to 232. And
right.
For one of the recent RFIs, yes, we have the launch of the investigation around PPE and medical equipment and medical consumables. This is separate from the review around pharmaceuticals, as far as really evaluating the threat to national security around the imports of those products. More than anything else, of what's impacting, I think, for a lot of manufacturers, regardless of industry, is going to be the investigation that was launched and the request for comment around the machinery and robotics. Right. Because as we understand it, a lot of domestic manufacturers can't source their equipment here in the United States. They have to import it. So as the Trump administration is really looking to be able to support domestic investment and expansion of domestic production, those equipment, that robotics may not be available here, but it's necessary to be imported to achieve those goals. So this will be one that I think is garnering a lot of attention. HTS codes, haven't been supplied yet, just the overall scope for how they define it, for, manufacturers in particular to watch carefully and engage as they find appropriate in it.
Fascinating. There's such a dynamic, push-pull in the timing of, trying to get the manufacturing here, but allowing for time so that, at the short-term impacts for the long-term gain, right? Which has, I think, been the balancing act of all of these, these trade remedies, and whether, one can argue whether they're working or not working to meet the objectives. So, well, your insight is always fascinating, Sarah. So thank you for that.
But I know that we are all navigating, the past several months, and yes, there's, I think, overall a lot to come, This is still the beginning for President Trump's agenda and being able to grow investment in the United States and ensure fairness and reciprocity with our trading partners. So nevertheless, it's certainly an opportunity for some and hardship for others. But as we've always talked about, how important it is to engage and be at the table as a part of these discussions to protect everyone's interests.
Yeah, I agree.
We're definitely going to have you on a program again, because this is so dynamic of topics, multiple topics, and it expands every time we talk about it. So
exactly, yes, no lack of material to talk about. Thank you for your insight, and look forward to having you back on the show. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandi. Thank you, Ken.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah.
You've been listening to Talking Trade with Sandi Siegel and Ken Wasylik, sponsored by the Wisconsin Center for Manufacturing and Productivity, Dairy Farmers of Wisconsin, Carroll University, and Michael Best Strategies.